So now that we've seen what the playwright class can do, let's dive into the specifics around what we do and what we need to do to create a new browser instance. As we saw, there are three methods we can use for this: Chromium, Firefox, and WebKit to create different types of browser objects. But there's a lot more that we can do when we actually create these browsers. When we grab our object, our Chromium, Firefox, or WebKit, we need to use the launch method to kick off the actual browser. So you can see in the code sample here, we've got Playwright. We create our Playwright instance overall, and then using Playwright, we call Chromium to create a Chromium browser, and then we launch the browser with the launch method. That will kick off a standard default configured browser of whatever type we choose. Now, but I want to configure my browser. I want to give it some options to when I kick it off. And that is very, very common in web testing for sure. So what we can do is we can pass in a launch options object into our launch, just like we can see here. We can see we're creating Playwright Chromium launch, but then we're passing a parameter, new browser type launch options, and we're giving some options. Now the launch options object is really, really configurable. Here's a really simple setup. We're setting some command line arguments that are quite common when you're creating WebDrive, when you're creating browser instances for test automation. Things like no sandbox, disable GPU, disable extensions. There are lots of other ones, but they're quite common ones. And we can add as many as we want using the set args option. In fact, there are quite a few of these options. Let's go through some of the more important ones. So this list is actually a subset. There must be hundreds of Chrome options that you can pass in, but not that many of them are used typically for web testing. Some of the more useful ones are no sandbox. That's quite common. And disable GPU. We do that to avoid glitchy tests. We can pass in headless, but there's a dedicated method to deal with headless operations that we'll see later on. So we usually don't do that. Sometimes you might use start maximized. I find this a little bit dangerous because it means your tests are actually starting off in a state that will depend on the configuration of your virtual display, which may vary. So I tend not to use that, but some folk do use it. Incognito, we'll see that's actually not necessary for when we're using Playwright, because Playwright has its own context, its own browser context that we work with, which work effectively, do the same thing as incognito. Then we have a few others options that we might want to disable. Disable info bars. So often when you create, when you start up Chrome in automation mode, it has this message: Chrome has been controlled by automated software. You can turn that off if you want to take screenshots and have nicer screenshots with disable info bars. You might want to start with a perfectly clean Chrome instance, disable extensions, or specify the window size that you want to start with. So rather than starting maximize, you specify a size. And there are a few other options. User agent, where you specify the text that you want to specify for the user agent, language, and so forth. Now, they're the Chrome options. Not all browsers have the same options. So we'll see Firefox here has slightly different options. Now, instead of incognito, we have the private, but then we have start maximized. Width and height are separate parameters rather than a single parameter together. Disable notifications, language, those ones are relatively similar. So we won't look at all of these in detail, but they're there in case you do need to really fine tune how you set up your browser. There are lots of other ways you can configure your browser instance when you start it off, though, that come out of the box with the launch options, and you don't need to pass in arguments for them. You can do things like set the environment variables if your application depends on certain environment variables being set. You can set the download path, very useful if you're testing what happens when you download a file. Do you download the right file? So you create a temporary directory and pass this into the set download path so you can check what gets downloaded there. Set headless if you want to activate the browser, the visible browser, so you can see what's going on. You can set that to false. Set slow-mo is an interesting one. Normally playwright tests are really fast as they possibly can be, but you might want to slow it down so you can see what's going on. So these are all great options you can use when you configure your WebDriver using the Chromium or Firefox or WebKit.launch method. But what happens if you're using the use playwright annotation that we saw in the last module? What we saw was that you could use playwright to simplify your tests and simply pass in a page, or as we'll see later on, a web context into your test, and then just go ahead and test the application using your page. How do you configure the WebDriver in that case? Well, it turns out there is a way. What we can do is we can use the custom options class to be able to set up our very own object that returns the options that we're interested in. So first of all, we need to implement the options factory. The options factory interface gives us a get options method, which will allow us to return an options object that contains all of the configuration we need. The options object itself, we can see here, we can set all of the options we saw earlier. So here we're setting headless and giving some launch options. But there are lots of other options that we can configure as well. Then what we need to do is set up the this particular class. So this custom options class, we need to specify it in the use playwright annotation. So the use playwright annotation knows where to get the options from. So it's a little bit more complicated, but it's once you know how to do it, it's not really a big deal. So let's dive into some code and have a look at how all this works in practice. Let's have a look at how we can configure browser options in our code. This is our little test suite that we wrote in the last lesson, where we simply open up our test website, check the title, then check what happens when we perform a search. Do we see the right results? Or do we see any results at all, in fact? So this should work fine. Let's run this just to confirm that we do have some working tests to start with. So that will kick everything off. And we have 2 tests that run just fine. Now what we're going to do is configure our browser so that it can start in not headless mode, so we can actually see what happens when it kicks off. And the way we do this is we pass in a new browser type launch options, and we can set lots of things. We can set headless to false. Let's see what happens when we do this. So I'm going to run these tests again. I've set headless equals false. Let's run one of them to see. And we can see a browser pops up. So if we want to expand on this, we can also add other options. So the options we saw in the course are set arguments. We could create an arrays as list, and we could pass in no sandbox. We could pass in disable extensions or disable GPU. That would work as well. Disable GPU and so forth. And when we run these tests again, we won't see any difference, but the browser will start up with those options running. So we've got one browser starting out for the first test and then for the second test. So that's how we configure our browser options when we have full control over the Playwright instance and the Playwright Chromium launch command. We can pretty much do whatever we want. Now let's have a look at what happens when we want to use the use playwright annotation. The second type of test that we saw in the last module was our annotated playwright test, where we use the use playwright annotation so that we can simply write a test and pass in the page that we want to work with. Now to configure that, so that our browser has the options we want, we need to do something a little bit more complicated. We need to create our own class called an options class. And we do this by implementing the options factory class. So I can say public static class, my options implements options factory coming from the Microsoft package as usual. And now I'm going to make this override the getOptions method. So the getOptions is the one we need to override, and here we can return a new options object. Now the options object allows us to provide a number of options. So we can do things like set headless to false. We can set the launch options. So they're the same as we did last time, new launch options. And then in our launch options, and then we can set the arguments, for example, create a little arrays as list and then pass in those sandbox and so forth. And then once we've defined this class, we need to use it. We need to pass in the myOptions class into the use playwright annotation. So once we've done that, we can now run our test and it will pick up these options here. So we should see the browser open up here for each test. So that's how we set up browser options when we're using the use